No problem. Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you. Thank you, Debbie, for the invitation to talk about some key issues facing the state and on the local level as well in Denver. And ballot questions are really critical. And of course, while this is not the most exciting topic, we're thrilled to have you join us on a 10 a.m. call for discussion around ballot questions. As Debbie mentioned earlier, the ballot is lighter this year than we would normally see, although every other year the ballot at the state level is lighter. And the reason for that is under Tabor, only tax questions can be on off election year or odd year elections. And so we see that reflected in this year's ballot as well, but doesn't mean that they are no less important, of course. And what we do anticipate, of course, is next year, much like we see on every even year election, to see a lot of the policy discussions that emerge in even year election cycles. And so while we're fortunate to have a smaller ballot with which to contend this year, we fully anticipate an active year next year. But in the meantime, we can sit back and have a conversation about what is facing us this election cycle. And we're going to talk about state questions as well as some Denver questions that are on the ballot. You're actually seeing a lot fewer questions, even at the local level. Again, in a odd election year with tax questions, you're seeing fewer questions across the state on tax questions, largely because of the benefits that have accrued to local governments from the federal government in response to COVID, and the decline in revenue that has then been shored up through additional relief coming from the federal level. So across the state, you're seeing fewer questions that you would normally see related to taxes and such. But Denver has a very full ballot. They have a number of bond questions that are pending before the voters this year. And then a series of initiated measures that deal with various policy pieces that we will touch on this morning. And so wanted to, again, express my thanks to Debbie for inviting me, but also as I engage with Chris, to let you know just how fortunate we are to have an organization like the Common Sense Institute, really analyzing and assessing ballot questions, and more importantly, the various policy matters that we contend with on an annual basis legislatively. And so you're probably quite familiar with CSI. They have become very active partners in the policy arena. And again, really providing important input and perspective to those discussions. Perspective that up until, 3 years ago or so, really those perspectives not really shared from the point of view of, from our point of view, sort of that business mindset and that business lens. And they've just really set an incredible tone for engaging in important policy discussions and bringing to light the various economic impacts of the policies that are being debated. So really grateful that we have them as partners in the business community to really dive deeply into the impacts and the larger conversation around the fiscal impacts of policy. So with that in mind, they have taken that similar lens as they've looked at the myriad of ballot questions that we have both at the state and some of those in Denver to discuss. So we will just kick it off, and what we're going to do is go through their ballot guide one by one. Chris is going to share perspective on each one of these. I'll ask a series of questions perhaps, and then, as Debbie mentioned, we'll begin to open it up with questions and comments from you all as well, so that this can be a good dialogue around what's important to you. So with that, I'm going to kick it off and ask Chris to share his thoughts on the first ballot question that we have at the state level.
Great, and thank you guys for that introduction. Good to see some familiar faces and names on this call as well. Really appreciate, and always enjoy the engagement with the Colorado Business Roundtable as well. So look forward to some tough questions. Expect that here. I guess I would echo what Debbie and Sandra said in terms of the ballot may seem a little lighter, but I'll just say, don't sleep on these issues. I think it's not Proposition 112 and a 2,500 setback that we're looking at, potential economic loss that would be unprecedented in many ways, well, prior to COVID at least. It's not paid family medical leave, which impacts employers and employees in pretty distinct ways. It's not Amendment 73 and a progressive income tax. However, the three measures which are on the ballot this year, statewide, will have lasting and pretty profound effects, both from a revenue standpoint, from a legal standpoint. So some interesting nuance that hopefully we can parse out, and look forward to, again, your questions and some of the dialogue here, Sandra. So again, as I said, there are three statewide measures. We analyzed two as part of our ballot guide. Proposition 119, the Learning Enrichment Academic Program. And I think I got that acronym right. You can correct me if I'm wrong on and Proposition 120, the property tax assessment rate drop. There is a third measure, Amendment 73, related to custodial funds. And I'd be happy to answer questions. Sandra, maybe we can get into that a little bit and kind of discuss what that is. We didn't put out any additional research beyond what's in the Blue Book there and what's in the fiscal note from the Legislative Council staff. But nonetheless, it's an important one and something, again, should be aware of. And then we looked at three measures within the city of County of Denver. Again, there's many more that possibly have some insight into, but did not include directly in our ballot guide. So the first issue that wanted to highlight again is LEAP. This is an interesting program, proposal to establish a new program that would distribute funds directly to students to obtain out-of-school learning enrichment opportunities, sort of outside of the existing K-12 school infrastructure. So this is something that I believe the proponents, I've heard them talk, they've discussed this and had this as a potential proposal for years, but I think in the light of COVID and the recent learning loss and what we've seen in test scores for K-12 students, it comes at an interesting time that I think it's important to understand the sort of potential for near-term impact, but also sustained impact on student achievement and student outcomes. So the program itself is funded by an additional 5% increase on recreational marijuana. So it brings the statewide sales tax on recreational marijuana from 15% to 20%, and has a transfer of about $22 million from revenue from the state land board, which is an existing source of revenue that otherwise those funds would be transferred to the public education permanent fund and used in a sort of sustaining way, but now would be diverted to the LEAP program. And in total, long-term, over about full implementation over 3 years, generates about $160 million, estimated to generate about $160 million that, again, would be distributed back to students, eligible K-12 students, for the purpose of obtaining these out-of-school learning enrichment opportunities. And we looked at the program really from the perspective of how many students could this reach? How far could this go? And from a single, if you look at an individual student that would obtain the maximum benefit out of this, which would be capped at $1,500, a single student could obtain about 2.5 hours of tutoring per week of the school year, over 32 weeks in the school year. Or, if you look across the entire, cohort of students that would be eligible, this program is intended to prioritize low-income students and be made available to those at or below 100, 150% of the federal poverty level. And with some of the work we did just to analyze potential costs of these programs and these types of services, it really does have the potential to reach more than 100% of students at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. That's more than 90,000 students, more than 10% of the student population in Colorado. So, potential for significant reach, and comes at a time when we've seen, again, about a 6% increase in the number of students who underperformed on math in the grades that were tested last year. And, so it's an important program in some ways that will provide these extracurricular opportunities, these opportunities outside of the normal hours of school to obtain this type of really targeted educational resource that otherwise, they may not have access to. So, there's some trade-offs, and there's a cost here, undoubtedly, on both the tax increase and the transfer from the existing revenue stream, but again, has significant potential and a sustaining sort of resource for Colorado students for years to come. So, Sandra, I'll maybe kick it back to you, and curious to get your thoughts on this particular measure as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that overview. It's a really interesting approach to addressing the learning shortfalls for students. And it is particularly fascinating that this is a concept that's been around for a little while, and the opportunity certainly well presented itself with COVID and the declining academic performance of these students. What's also curious in this measure, not curious, but really sort of says a lot about the approach that's being taken here. It is supported from folks on both sides of the aisle. Former Governor Ritter and former Governor Owens have both come out strongly in favor of this approach. Senator Bob Gardner, who's a pretty conservative member as well, has spoken out. And so you see it crossing the political divide in terms of approach. I think what we've also seen related specific to the fiscal piece is generally taxes of this type, what I refer to as sin taxes across the state, are successful. Statewide sales taxes and the like have failed over time, and since the passage of Tabor, we haven't seen the success of those. But things like taxes on marijuana, tobacco, other sin taxes have been successful. And so I think that this one is curious. Now, Chris, I'm curious your thoughts with respect to the utilization of general funds as well as state land boards and the state land board funds, and what the impact, the potential impact on state land boards, particular, might be with respect to the utilization of those dollars.
Yeah, I think it is and I can't speak to the proponents' reasoning for including that piece as a revenue stream. Again, they added that on along with the increased tax on marijuana. I will say, it is the state land board and land trust revenue was set up, I don't know, decades ago as a sustaining investment for public education, for students. And, you guys are business people, you have investment accounts, if you don't replenish the principal, if you're not building and sustaining the investment amount, you can't generate as much earnings off of that each year. And the Ledge Council, that number will grow over time as the annual amount of money contributed to the public school permanent fund is depleted. So I believe the Legislative Council estimated that over about the course of a decade, this would reduce the interest and capital spinoff revenue to schools by about $40 million. But that number, over 20 years is probably 3 times that. So it is a curious piece that they included this. It does have, long-term impacts on the ability for that fund to continue to support education. The flip side is it's only maybe spinning off $20 million a year. And in the big scheme of public education at the moment, it's not a large piece of the $7+ billion the state contributes to public education. So we have to keep that in context as well. But I think it's there's obviously a short-term interest in this, but there might be a real long-term consequence.
Perfect. Thank you for that insight. Appreciate it. Why don't we move on to Proposition 120?
Okay, great. This is an interesting measure, and maybe you've seen some of the press cover this. There's there's the numbers behind it, and we can talk about what it does. But there's also, I'll say a little drama, a little, background on the political side of how this is playing out that complicates the analysis, because there is the interaction between the ballot measure, which has yet to be voted on, but with a state piece of legislation, which the state legislature passed earlier this year, in many ways are directly preempting to try to change the outcome of this measure before Coloradans even vote on it. So Proposition 120 started out to be pretty simple. It was shall, assessment rates, property tax assessment rates for residential commercial property owners be reduced by about 9%, 8-9%. Dropping the commercial assessment rate from 29 to 26.4, dropping the residential assessment rate from 7.15 to 6.5. That was sort of the intent and how it was originally outlined. However, as soon as this received its title, was in the midst of collecting signatures, we have actually a podcast just recorded yesterday on this. If you have interest in more information, with Michael Fields, who was the proponent of this. I think it was just 2 days after this qualified, the legislature introduced Senate Bill 293, which proposed and passed. It temporarily cuts assessment rates for the next 2 years and permanently changes the classification of property, so that the ballot, the Proposition 120, if it passed, would only apply to lodging in commercial property and multifamily on the residential side. So voters, single family, homeowners voting on this, commercial property owners, business owners that are looking at this and saying, how will this impact my property tax? My assessment went up 20%, a 9% drop, I'd still see a 10% increase. You may find out that if, and this will have to be sorted out in court, but if 293 holds and courts say that this is legal and will hold despite what voters say in November, you will not face a tax cut despite the title saying you will. And the revenue impacts are significant. It's a difference between about a $1.1 billion reduction in projected revenue against about 150 million impact in projected property tax revenue across the state. So that's a huge difference in the outcome, both for individuals and from a fiscal standpoint. So, this is a complicated one because of the Senate Bill 293, but in light of the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment, where we've seen prices go and property values, I think something people should take a hard look at and sort of consider the alternative.
Yeah, this one really is a interesting political dynamic at play, and I think it challenges the way in which future initiatives sort of move forward. Many of you are well aware that oftentimes initiatives are put forward as a offset to legislative measures that are unfolding, or reversal, of course, or just driving an agenda forward that aligns with your own interests. To have the legislature pass legislation to effectively preempt that which is on the ballot really does call into question the appropriateness, constitutionality, all of those questions come into mind. I know there is discussion with respect to obviously litigating this, presumably post-election, Chris, and your thoughts, and maybe in your conversation with Michael and your podcast, you explored this. What's the viability of challenging or defeating, overturning 293 within the courts, or what's their assessment of that likelihood?
Well, yeah, again, I think if this passes, and I often say this, but I'm not a lawyer, so I don't try to play that game and predict the outcome of where courts might gauge some of these issues and how they might rule. So I don't think, maybe it's a coin toss what the ultimate outcome is, I think, in reality, but there are some strong arguments from what you just said in the sense that constitutionally, we have a legislative process to create law, and we have a citizen-led ballot process. And these are constitutionally separated and not that the legislature can't change statute, that's not what I'm saying, but by directly in the law trying to preempt and say, should a ballot measure pass that does this, then this law does this, and knowingly maneuvering the outcome of the citizen-led process is, again, I think, from what I've heard, read, unprecedented. I don't know if this has happened before. Yeah. And so it sets maybe a bad precedent. If there is another citizen measure to do something else, could the legislature come in and just move this where it exists in statute and just say, we're going to change this part of law exists somewhere else in statute, and then the ballot measure is null because of some legal technicality, and is that really appropriate? On top of it, I think there's a strong argument that if voters approve this, possibly maybe in a convincing fashion, this would be the more recent law as well. And there is, if the courts have to sort out conflicting elements, they would look to, well, what's the most recent? So I think there's a couple strong arguments on multiple fronts. And so, we shall see. But, I think the bigger picture for me is really post Gallagher, post Amendment B, and now freezing of assessment rates. Coloradans are in a tough position with property taxes going up at the same rate that your property goes up. There's no formula to maneuver. Now, commercial property owners have dealt with that forever. Residential property owners have had some relief from the Gallagher Amendment, unintended consequences, which is why voters approved Amendment B there. But so this is again not a long-term fix. It's another measure coming up post Amendment B. Educate yourself, because there will be a lot more property tax measures, I think, in the coming years that try to deal with different issues in the way the system works. So this is not by any means a long-term fix. But it might address maybe some short-term pain, but there's some real regional disparities, some real consequences across the state that by dropping these assessment rates, you put a lot of pressure on other, local entities to raise mills or to offset, potential revenue loss. So it's complicated, but nonetheless, different elements here to kind of understand.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for that overview. Again, I think the precedent-setting nature just on the policy side and the politics side is really, really key. But to your point, the issue itself, or the question itself, has important implications brought generally from a financial perspective, and the openness with which Amendment B left the question on assessment rates really challenged, and actually it was sort of the hole that the Mack truck could be driven through with respect to the policy side. And it's sort of curious, they left that hole open in Amendment D because they felt that if they put a number in, that the whole question would be defeated on Amendment B. So the legislature, the proponents of 293, of course, found themselves like, oh wait, that's not what we intended. So precedent setting, so keep an eye on that, but do dive into this question. Let's move into, if we might, the Denver questions.
Great. Great. Okay, so try to cover these fairly quickly. I'm sure we have some Denver residents, and again, there's a lot more on the ballot to look at and understand. There's two measures directly related to homelessness and homeless spending. I guess there is a third as well in easements, related to easement questions, which we did not directly include, and the safe and sound, I think technically maybe you could say as well, in some ways relates to homelessness. However, these two issues we featured because they sort of relate to expenses and expenditures. We released an analysis. One of my colleagues, Dr. Brenda Dickonner, released a paper, I think about a month ago, and we have another one coming out related to homelessness in the coming weeks, that analyzed the scope of what we called sort of the homeless serving industry, and from a financial resource standpoint, from manpower, from types of organizations, number of organizations, and found that in Denver alone, there was about $430 million annually in total expenditures related to homelessness. That puts a range of about $40,000 to $100,000 per individual experiencing homelessness on an annual basis. This is prior to COVID. This is prior to the federal relief numbers. And these two measures, Ordinance 303 and Bond Question 2B, would in some way demand more expenditures or put more expenditures into the system, but don't require a tax increase. So I think I should want to make sure that that's clear. Ordinance 303 is called Let's Do Better, and it would do two things. One is it would, private citizens, Denver residents, can call the city and report individuals that are violating the existing camping ban, and the city would have to address and vacate those individuals if they were in fact violating the camping ban within, I believe, 24 to 36 hours, or the citizen could actually press legal challenges against the city. And then the second part of this measure is it requires the city to establish 4 designated camping areas for individuals experiencing homelessness throughout the city. So it really, with sanitary accommodations, with running water and restrooms. And 2B is one of the Mayor Hancock's bonding questions, which asks for about $37 million of existing revenue that's paid for through citizens already, that would fund a new bond that would be used to acquire new property for permanent housing and emergency sheltering for those experiencing homelessness as well. So that brings the total in expenditures to over $500 million. That's a conservative number. I'd be happy to get into that as well, but just kind of give you a sense of the scale and focus from a budgeting and sort of financial standpoint on this particular issue and some of the issues that are moving. So yeah, Sandra, I don't know if there's anything I missed.
No, that's great. I would mention, of course, yes, the homelessness issue is significant in Denver, and we're seeing it creep into other communities as well, of course. It's notable the city of Denver, the city council in Denver has expressed their opposition, actually taken a formal opposition to 303, believing that the 72-hour window presents legal conflict with some federal law and federal settlement. So that's a point of contention, but my sense is the way in which this question is framed, the likelihood of success is pretty significant. So they can deal with the sort of the legal questions post passage, but I would expect that this one will pass.
Yeah, this is another one that has that legal conflict, and you're right that timing. I think the current requirement is 7 days.
7 days, yeah.
7 days to vacate after being notified of violating the camping ban, and so this bumps that to 2 to 3 days, which again is a pretty significant difference. But yeah, to your point, courts will settle this out somehow.
Exactly. Let's move on to the next one.
Okay, Great. So the last one here, just wanted to touch on is Ordinance 304, or enough taxes already is the term. Denver residents have approved 7 incremental sort of special sales taxes on top of the 3.5% sales tax base rate in the city over the last 10-15 years. 6 of those incremental special sales taxes have been passed in the last 3 years. So that brings the overall base sales tax, sort of sales tax rate, to 4.81%. And so this chart here shows that history of the sales tax base rate. Again, this is excluding those special sales taxes on recreational marijuana and some special items that get taxed at higher rates. But you can see what the ordinance is asking is, if, as the green line shows, do voters want to reduce the sales tax, overall sales tax, to 4.5%, capping it at that rate? And if voters approve a measure to increase the sales tax rate or increase a special sales tax in the future, city council or the measure itself would have to somehow maneuver other rates to stay under that cap. It's about a 6.5% reduction in revenue against the projection. So in the 2022 collections, about a 6.5% reduction in revenue. It's about a 0.5% cut from year to year in revenue between the estimate and actual collections from 21 to 22. And but revenue is still projected to be 12% higher in 22 than it was in 2019, given how much rates have increased. So this is again a measure that is a limiting factor on where sales taxes and taxes are in the city, county of Denver, but complications with how voters have approved measures and added on incremental sales taxes, again, including last year approved, climate change fund, approved 0.25% for homelessness. So there's, some complication in how those will be sorted out, but nonetheless, this is sort of this general overview of let's do better. Enough taxes already, sorry. 304.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that overview. I think this one is really fascinating. It's rare that you see a tax decrease in Denver as a resident of Denver. You just don't see that. So it will be fascinating to see how this fares within Denver, whose residents are very quick to approve tax increases in the city. So this will be fascinating to see how this unfolds. It also is opposed by the city council, not surprisingly, arguing, of course, that it will result in a reduction in services and a diversion of funds away from critical services. So look forward to seeing the outcome on this one in Denver.
Yeah.
With that, Debbie, why don't we shift over to